Wall Street analysts have concluded that the fair market value of a privatized space logistics monopoly is accurate, give or take $1 trillion. It is Tuesday, July 7th, 2026, and on today's issue of the Daily Shear, Texas purchases 2,000 vehicle assembly jobs, the president converts the nation's youth into mandatory retail investors, and the federal government decides that the most efficient way to manage a bureaucracy is to eliminate it on a federal holiday. I am Lambert Woollingham, and this is the documentation of our collective decline. We begin with the municipal balance sheets, where local governments continue to heavily subsidise the privilege of being paved over. State and municipal officials have successfully purchased 2,000 new manufacturing jobs by delivering a $303 million incentive package to convince Toyota to expand its footprint in San Antonio. The automaker will pour $3.6 billion into building a second vehicle assembly line, shifting production of the Tacoma pickup truck back to Texas, after previously moving those operations to Mexico. Local boards fast-tracked the 9-figure tax abatement to secure the deal against competing municipalities. Construction is expected to begin immediately as the city anchors its economic future to the assumption that consumers will never lose their appetite for driving heavy utility vehicles to the grocery store. The Texas Stock Exchange has officially commenced trading operations in Dallas, initiating a phased rollout designed to challenge the institutional monopolies of the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. The new marketplace aims to lure corporate listings away from the East Coast by promising lighter regulatory burdens, initially focusing on exchange-traded funds and smaller corporate equities. Proponents argue it will provide regional firms with a sympathetic local venue for capital generation. Industry analysts remain skeptical that a regional startup can siphon meaningful liquidity from entrenched Wall Street giants, but the launch establishes a functional alternative for corporations who prefer their compliance standards with a slight drawl. Municipal data reveals that Austin's accelerated homeless encampment clearing initiative processed 127 separate locations during its first 30 days. City crews and local law enforcement dismantled the sites as part of a renewed push to enforce public camping bans across visible transit corridors. The high volume of interventions reflects a sharp tactical shift, funneling budgetary resources into physical abatement rather than outreach services. Despite the aggressive pace, sanitation records indicate populations quickly returned to the exact same greenbelts shortly after city trucks departed. Administrators are analysing the figures to justify further operational funding, perfectly documenting the futility of chasing the unhoused in a continuous circle around the city limits. Austin infrastructure officials are finalising the engineering blueprints required to demolish and entirely replace the century-old Barton Springs Road Bridge. The municipal crossing over the primary vehicular artery into Zilker Park recently reached the end of its structural lifespan. The Transportation Department intends to initiate the reconstruction phase in the summer of 2027, guaranteeing severe traffic disruptions. Planners are drafting phased lane closures, though severing the main recreational corridor during peak swimming season will inevitably strain alternative routes. The final design promises wider pedestrian walkways, provided the city can successfully navigate the logistics of dismantling a deteriorating concrete structure without dropping it on the swimmers below. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has extracted a $13 million settlement from Walmart to resolve an investigation into compensation practices for independent delivery drivers. The Consumer Protection Division determined that the proprietary Spark driver logistics platform systematically misrepresented how it calculated gig worker earnings. The platform algorithms manipulated base pay metrics and improperly absorbed customer pre-tips explicitly intended for the drivers. Under the agreement, Walmart must immediately distribute the collected funds to the affected workers and overhaul its digital payment disclosures. The corporation accepted the penalty without admitting formal legal liability, treating the 8-figure payout as nothing more than a standard operational cost for the privilege of skimming off the top of its own delivery network. We turn now to the broader financial markets, where the algorithms are actively pricing in a reality that none of us can currently see. As the federally mandated quiet period expires, the lead underwriters for SpaceX have initiated official stock coverage with radically divergent assessments of the aerospace manufacturer's actual financial worth. Analysts at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley both issued immediate buy recommendations, yet their internal models produced a valuation gap exceeding $1 trillion. The discrepancy highlights the speculative guesswork required to price a privatized space monopoly operating entirely outside conventional commercial revenue metrics. The appraisals arrive just as SpaceX prepares to join the NASDAQ 100 index, automatically forcing passive funds to acquire the stock regardless of fundamental pricing. Retail traders are now left navigating an equity asset that Wall Street investment banks cannot accurately value within a $1 trillion margin of error. A coalition of prominent conservative organizations has formally petitioned the Federal Communications Commission to strip the American Broadcasting Company of its broadcast licenses for 8 local television stations. The filing accuses the Disney-owned network of systemic political bias and operating as a sympathetic conduit for the Chinese Communist Party. The aggressive maneuver capitalizes on a highly unusual procedural directive issued by FCC Chairman Brendan Carr, who forced ABC to submit its license renewal applications years ahead of schedule. By weaponizing federal spectrum allocation, political operatives aim to inflict massive compliance costs on a targeted network, forcing corporate attorneys to spend millions defending their legal right to transmit daytime television. We have an update on the federal government's foray into subsidized youth equity trading, which has officially gone live with President Trump ringing the New York Stock Exchange opening bell. The ceremonial event activated the Trump Accounts initiative, depositing $1,000 of taxpayer funds into a privately managed Wall Street investment portfolio for every eligible American child. The deployment physically shifts billions of federal dollars into private brokerage firms, converting millions of minors into mandatory retail investors before they even know how to read a prospectus. While the administration champions the policy as an engine for generational wealth, economists warn it effectively eliminates guaranteed state entitlements. Financial institutions are quietly celebrating the influx of captive capital, carrying absolutely no withdrawal risk for 18 years. The contraction of the technology sector continues with an update from Microsoft, which has executed a brutal reduction of its global workforce by eliminating 4,800 positions. The structural reset is heavily concentrated on the struggling Xbox gaming division and commercial sales departments, arriving just days after staff were warned of impending austerity measures. Alongside the headcount reductions, Microsoft is aggressively offloading corporate liabilities by spinning off 4 previously acquired development houses into independent studios. The divestment forces the discarded teams to assume their own financial risks, while allowing Xbox to retain the licensing rights to their lucrative intellectual properties. The drastic reorganization confirms that executives are cannibalizing their own product lines to fund infinite artificial intelligence investments. Cryptocurrency mining operator TeraWulf has secured a $19 billion data center lease agreement with artificial intelligence developer Anthropic, triggering an immediate surge in the stock valuation of the infrastructure firm. Under the contract, TeraWulf will pivot its vast power reserves away from volatile digital asset processing to physically host the advanced machine learning models of Anthropic. The transaction absorbs a significant portion of the computing capacity of the energy provider, locking in a predictable revenue stream that completely bypasses the erratic cryptocurrency markets. For Anthropic, committing $19 billion to secure raw megawattage is an absolute necessity to prevent hardware bottlenecks. The migration of these industrial assets confirms that processing natural language algorithms has eclipsed blockchain ledgers as the preferred method for burning fossil fuels in a windowless warehouse. We move finally to the national and global headlines, where the consequences of administrative decisions are making themselves physically known. The United States Supreme Court has granted the Trump administration's sweeping authority to dismantle the Temporary Protected Status Program, delivering a devastating legal blow to roughly 1.3 million immigrants residing legally within the country. In its ruling, the conservative majority determined the executive branch holds near absolute discretion to revoke humanitarian designations, brushing aside lower court injunctions. Immigration advocates challenged the revocation efforts by presenting documentation they argued proved the policy shift was driven by explicit racial animus rather than statutory review. The justices rejected that argument, ruling that plaintiffs failed to establish discriminatory intent legally invalidated the authority of the Homeland Security Secretary. The judicial clearance effectively hands the White House the exact legal mechanism it requires to uproot long-established communities, completing a systematic dismantling of the asylum infrastructure. A Texas district judge has ordered CPS Energy, the municipally owned utility of San Antonio, to pay nearly $400 million to a pair of natural gas subsidiaries operated by pipeline giant Energy Transfer. Judge Laura Salinas issued the crippling financial judgment after determining the public utility breached supply contracts during the catastrophic February 2021 winter storm. CPS Energy spent 5 years fighting the invoices, arguing the supplier engaged in unlawful price gouging while the state grid collapsed in sub-freezing temperatures. The judicial ruling rejects the utility consumer defense, affirming that predatory emergency pricing was entirely permissible under the deregulated structures of the Texas energy market. The devastating 9-figure penalty will now be transferred directly onto the monthly billing statements of San Antonio residents who are legally obligated to cover the corporate windfall generated by their own risk of freezing to death. The Department of Government Efficiency, the aggressively branded task force responsible for dismantling massive segments of the federal bureaucracy, officially terminated its own operations on the 4th of July. The temporary agency concluded its mandate after forcing through historic reductions in federal employment and stripping budgetary funding from dozens of legacy regulatory programs. The closure fulfills the administration promise to execute a swift strike against the civil service rather than establishing a permanent oversight commission. The anonymous operators celebrated their dissolution with a social media dispatch quoting Theodore Roosevelt on the virtues of hard work, a distinctly sanitized sign-off for a team that just spent months vaporizing thousands of public sector livelihoods. The brief lifespan demonstrated that a motivated executive branch requires very little time to inflict permanent institutional damage. The United States Supreme Court has refused to issue an emergency injunction against a highly contested Texas statute that legally mandates strict age verification protocols across digital application storefronts. The administrative ruling allows state authorities to actively enforce the law, forcing corporate gatekeepers like Apple and Google to deploy comprehensive identity screening tools. A coalition of advocacy groups desperately petitioned the High Court to block the mandate, arguing it inflicted severe First Amendment violations by effectively requiring all users to surrender government identification to access standard platforms. By declining to intervene, the conservative justices cleared a direct path for the Texas Attorney General to begin prosecuting multinational technology conglomerates. The judicial inaction forces software distributors to choose between abandoning the lucrative Texas market or constructing an incredibly invasive verification apparatus for millions of adults who just want to download a digital spirit level. We are following an update out of the Middle East, where the Iranian government has officially launched an exhaustive 6-day state funeral for former Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The public mourning period arrives following a highly unusual 4-month delay after he was assassinated during the opening waves of the military bombardment by the United States and Israel. Millions of heavily organized mourners flooded the streets of Tehran as the regime finally presented the preserved remains of the authoritarian cleric. Islamic scholars noted that keeping the body in state storage was a severe breach of religious custom, exposing the intense security paranoia that gripped the capital. The sprawling procession is explicitly designed to project institutional continuity, featuring the sudden public re-emergence of senior military commanders who remained completely hidden until it was physically safe to attend a funeral. It is worth lingering for a moment on the $19 billion data center lease signed by Anthropic today. You have a massive industrial warehouse filled with tens of thousands of processors. Until yesterday, those processors were running at maximum capacity, drawing enough municipal electricity to power a small city and generating enough thermal exhaust to change the local microclimate. Also, they could guess random alphanumeric strings fast enough to mint a single Bitcoin. Today, under the new contract, the building will be retrofitted. The cooling architecture will be upgraded. The power draw will increase, and those processors will go right back to running at maximum capacity, drawing the exact same electricity and venting the exact same heat, except now they are guessing the next word in a sentence, so a chatbot can automatically generate a passive-aggressive email to your landlord. We have secured $19 billion in capital to build a high-voltage furnace in the middle of nowhere, strictly so we never have to type out our own apologies. The industrial fans will continue to spin regardless of what the servers are thinking. I am Lambert Woollingham, and I will be outside attempting to manually age verify the neighborhood squirrels before they access the bird feeder. The day has been shorn. Until tomorrow.